My name is Arya Sterling. In the world of classical music, the name Sterling is synonymous with divine talent, but not because of me. To my parents, world-renowned conductors Julian and Elena Sterling, I was the broken chord, the daughter born without the spark. They poured every resource, every drop of affection, and every spotlight into my brother, Sebastian. He was their prodigy, the boy who composed symphonies at 12. But there is a secret hidden beneath the gold-leafed scores. Sebastian can't read a complex staff, let alone write a masterpiece. For 15 years, I have been his ghost. Every haunting melody, every intricate counterpoint that made the world weep was bled from my soul into his shadow. But tonight, at the Royal Command performance, the shadow is going to disappear. Tonight, the world will find out who the true maestro is. The ink on the parchment was still damp, a dark reflection of the midnight oil I had burned to finish the Solstice Symphony. I sat in the windowless basement of our Vienna estate, my studio, as my father called it, though it felt more like a cell. Above me, I could hear the muffled sounds of a celebration. My parents were hosting a gala for the elite of the musical world to celebrate Sebastian's latest achievement. They were toasting to a genius who was currently upstairs, probably struggling to tune his own violin, while the person who had actually breathed life into the music sat in the dark with stained fingers and a hollow heart. I stared at the final movement. It was a complex, soaring piece of architecture built from my own loneliness. In the Sterling household, music wasn't an art form, it was a currency. My father, Julian, saw talent as a tool for prestige. My mother, Elena, saw it as a way to maintain her status as the muse of the century. And because I was born with a slight tremor in my left hand, a physical flaw that in their eyes made me unfit for the stage, they had written me off before I hit puberty. Arya, is it done? The door creaked open. Sebastian stood there, his golden hair perfectly coiffed, his tuxedo tailored to perfection. He looked like a god of music. He looked like the lie we had been telling for over a decade. He walked over to the desk and snatched the score, his eyes scanning the notes with the uncomprehending gaze of a tourist looking at ancient hieroglyphics. This part, in the third movement, is it loud? It's a crescendo, Sebastian. It's a rising tide of desperation. Try not to make it sound like a brass band at a football match. He shrugged, unfazed by my sarcasm. Sebastian wasn't inherently evil. He was just weak. He enjoyed the fame, the women, and the way our father's eyes lit up when he spoke about the Sterling legacy. He had become addicted to the adulation, and I was the drug that kept the supply flowing. Arya, father says the royal family is expecting something transcendental for the London performance. He said if this goes well, the BBC will do a documentary on my creative process. I'll need you to write some notes for the interview. Something about, I don't know, birds singing in the morning or the tragedy of the human condition. I'll write the script, Sebastian. I always do. My parents entered the basement a few minutes later. My mother didn't even look at me. Her eyes went straight to the score in Sebastian's hand. She snatched it with a reverent sigh. "Oh, Sebastian, the complexity, the passion," she cried, pressing the paper to her chest. "Julian, look at this. The way he uses the oboe here, it's like a cry from the heavens. Our boy is a miracle." My father placed a heavy hand on Sebastian's shoulder, his face glowing with a pride he had never once directed at me. "The Sterling name will live forever because of you, son. You have the gift, not like some people who can only copy and transcribe." He threw a disparaging glance at me, standing in the corner. To them, I was just the copyist. They believed, or chose to believe, that Sebastian hummed the melodies and I simply put them on paper because I was good at the technical side. They had convinced themselves of this lie so thoroughly that they treated me like an administrative assistant rather than a composer. "Arya, make sure the digital backing tracks are synchronized for the rehearsal. Since Sebastian's compositional style is too intricate for a standard orchestra to grasp on short notice, we'll use the pre-recorded layers for the London show. You'll be in the booth, as usual." pre-recorded layers. That was the euphemism for the phonograph system they used to hide Sebastian's inability to perform the complex passages live. He would mimic the movements, his bow flying across the strings, while my recorded performance, played with the technical perfection they claimed I lacked, filled the hall. I was the sound, he was the image. I waited until they left before I picked up my violin. It was an old, battered instrument, not the Stradivarius they had bought for Sebastian. I tucked it under my chin and began to play the transition I had just written. My hand didn't tremor. It never tremored when I was alone. The music poured out of me, sharp, visceral, and terrifyingly beautiful. I wasn't just writing symphonies for my brother. I was writing a diary. Every snub, every cold dinner, every "you're not good enough" was woven into the counterpoints. I was building a bomb, one note at a time, and the London Royal Command performance was the fuse. I spent the next 2 weeks preparing. I didn't just synchronize the backing tracks, I modified the software. I created a kill switch that only I could activate from the control booth. I also began practicing, not in the basement, but in the small hours of the night when the house was silent. I played until my fingers bled, until the music was so ingrained in my nervous system that I didn't need the score. My parents were so busy planning the after-party in London, they didn't notice the change in me. They didn't notice the way I looked at the stage during the sound check at the Royal Albert Hall. They saw a quiet, dutiful daughter. They didn't see the maestro waiting to reclaim her throne. The night of the performance arrived. The Royal Albert Hall was a sea of velvet and diamonds. The king and queen sat in the royal box, their presence adding a suffocating weight to the atmosphere. Backstage, my father was pacing, giving Sebastian the final pep talk. "Remember, Sebastian, the world is watching. This is the moment you become immortal." Sebastian nodded, his face pale under the stage makeup. He looked terrified. For a moment, I felt a flicker of pity for him. He was a prisoner of their expectations as much as I was a prisoner of their neglect. But then I remembered the 4 symphonies he had taken credit for. I remembered the way he'd watched them tell me I had no talent and said nothing. The pity died. "Aria, to the booth," my mother snapped, adjusting her pearls. "The intro starts in 3 minutes. If the audio levels are off by even 1 decibel, it's your head. Don't ruin this for your brother." I walked to the control booth, a glass-walled room overlooking the stage. I sat down at the console, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. I looked at the play button for the digital backing track, the lie that would make Sebastian a legend. Then I reached for the kill switch and deactivated the entire audio system. Then I stood up, took my violin, and walked out of the booth, toward the stage door. My father tapped his baton. Sebastian moved his bow. Silence. The Prodigy stood there, frantically sawing at the strings, but no sound came out of the speakers. The audience began to whisper. My father's face went from confusion to rage. He spun around, looking for me, but I was already stepping out into the spotlight. The real maestro had arrived, and the world was finally going to hear the truth.
My dear ones, thank you for listening to this story. It makes me incredibly happy to feel that you are here with me. I try my best for you and post new videos every day, putting a piece of myself into them. If my stories resonate with you, your subscription and viewing of other videos will be the warmest support for me and inspiration to continue telling stories.
The silence of the Royal Albert Hall was not empty. It was a physical weight, a suffocating vacuum that swallowed the gasps of 5,000 people. I stood in the wings for a heartbeat, watching the spectacle of my brother's undoing. Sebastian was frantic, his bow scraping against the strings with the grace of a dying bird, his eyes darting toward the empty control booth in a silent scream for help. My father's baton was frozen in midair, a useless splinter of wood. The sterling genius had been unplugged, and all that remained was a terrified boy in an expensive suit. It was time to stop the charade. I stepped into the spotlight. The glare was blinding, a white wall of heat that stripped away my anonymity. I didn't look like a sterling. I didn't have the gold-leafed violin or the custom-made tuxedo. I was wearing a simple black dress, carrying a violin that had more scratches than varnish. As I walked toward the center of the stage, past my father, I felt his gaze burn into me. It wasn't pride, it was the look of a man watching his life's work catch fire. "Aria, what are you doing?" he hissed, his voice a jagged whisper that carried to the first few rows. "Get back to the booth. You've destroyed the system. You've ruined everything." I didn't answer. I didn't even look at him. I walked straight to the soloist's position, stopping inches away from Sebastian. My brother looked at me, his face a mask of sweating terror. He knew that the ghost had finally decided to haunt the house in broad daylight. Without a word, he backed away, his violin hanging limply from his hand, and stumbled toward the exit. The Prodigy vanished into the shadows, leaving the stage to the copyist. A low murmur rippled through the hall. I could see the royal box, the king leaning forward, his brow furrowed in confusion, while the queen whispered to an aide. This was a scandal in the making, a breach of protocol that should have ended in my immediate removal by security, but I didn't give them time to react. I tucked my battered violin under my chin, closed my eyes, and drew the bow across the strings. The first note was a low, guttural G, a sound of raw earth and ancient grief. It wasn't the polished, sanitized version I had recorded for Sebastian. It was the original thought, the unedited scream of a soul that had been silenced for 15 years. The hall went deathly still. Even my father, who had his mouth open to shout for the guards, froze. The Solstice Symphony began, not as a coordinated effort with a digital backing track, but as a solo improvisation that wove the missing orchestral parts into a single breathtaking melody. I played through the first movement, the basement. It was a rhythmic, driving piece that captured the claustrophobia of my studio, the ticking of the clock, and the scratching of the pen. Every snub, every cold glance from my mother, every time my father had told me I was merely a technician, I put it all into the vibrato. My left hand, the one they claimed was broken by a tremor, was a blur of precision. There was no tremor, there was only fire. I saw my mother in the wings, her hand over her mouth. She was an expert musician. She knew the score better than anyone. She recognized the themes. She recognized the soul behind the notes. She realized in that horrific moment of clarity that she had spent a decade worshiping a golden calf while the true God was scrubbing the floors. My father tried to reclaim control. Habit took over. He raised his baton and tried to lead the orchestra to follow me, to turn this disaster into a surprise performance. But the orchestra didn't look at him. They looked at me. They were seasoned professionals, and they knew within 10 bars that they were in the presence of something they had never encountered in Sebastian, a true master. They began to play along, tentatively at first, then with a swelling, passionate intensity. They weren't following the baton, they were following the bow. I moved into the second movement, the echo. This was the music Sebastian had composed 3 years ago, the piece he won the International Grand Prix with. But I played it differently. I played the hidden melodies, the ones I had edited out to make it accessible for his limited skill. The complexity was staggering. I saw my king turn to the queen and nod, his expression changing from confusion to absolute awe. In the middle of the movement, I opened my eyes and looked directly at my father. He was sweating, his movements jerky and desperate. He was still trying to conduct me, to pretend he was the architect of this moment. I broke the tempo. I accelerated into a cadenza so difficult, so technically demanding that it was humanly impossible to follow. I left him behind. I left the orchestra behind. I stood alone in the center of the Royal Albert Hall, playing a piece of music that didn't exist on any score. It was the sound of a prisoner breaking her chains. I was no longer Aria Sterling, the invisible daughter. I was the composer of the Solstice Symphony, and I was taking my name back. The music reached a fever pitch. I was no longer playing the violin. The violin was an extension of my nervous system. I could feel the vibrations in my teeth, in my marrow. The audience was leaning forward as one, a single organism held captive by a wooden box and 4 strings. I saw the BBC cameras pivoting toward me, the red lights glowing. This wasn't just a concert anymore. It was a global unveiling. The lie was being burned away by the friction of horsehair on gut. As I approached the finale, I saw Sebastian watching from the darkness of the stage door. He looked broken. He had lived his life as a mask, and the mask had just melted. He saw me, the sister he had used, the girl he had let his parents belittle, and for the first time he saw the magnitude of what he had stolen. He didn't look angry, he looked ashamed. My father dropped his baton. It clattered on the floor, a tiny sound that felt like a gunshot in a cathedral. He stepped back from the podium, his face pale, his legacy crumbling in the light of the truth. He had spent his life trying to manufacture greatness, failing to realize it was growing in his own shadow, unfed and unloved. I played the final note, a high, shimmering harmonic that lingered in the air long after the bow had left the string. It was a question, a plea, and a declaration. I stood in the silence, my chest heaving, the violin still tucked under my chin. For 3 seconds, nobody moved. The hall was a tomb of held breath. Then the king stood up. He didn't clap at first. He just looked at me, a profound respect in his eyes. Then he began to applaud, slowly, deliberately. The Queen joined him, then the front row, then, like a dam breaking, the entire hall erupted. It wasn't the polite applause for a prodigy, it was the roar of a crowd that had just witnessed a miracle. I didn't bow. I didn't look at my parents. I walked off the stage, past my frozen father, past my weeping mother, and straight to the stage door. Sebastian stepped aside, his head bowed in a silent apology I wasn't ready to accept. I walked out of the Royal Albert Hall and into the cool London night. The music was over, but the symphony had just begun. Behind me, I could hear the chaos, the press, the fans, the panicked voices of my parents trying to explain the unexplainable. But I didn't care. I had played the truth, and the truth, I realized, was the only audience I ever really needed.
The world woke up to a new name, but I woke up in the same cold house that had tried to bury me. By 6 a.m., the gates of our Vienna estate were besieged by journalists, their lenses pointed at our windows like cannons. Every major publication, from the New York Times to Le Monde, had the same headline: "The Ghost of the Albert Hall. Who is Aria Sterling?" The video of my performance had gone viral, a digital wildfire that no PR team could extinguish. But inside the house, the atmosphere wasn't one of celebration. It was a war room where the losers were trying to negotiate a surrender that looked like a victory. I sat in the grand dining room, a space that usually felt like a museum of my parents' achievements. My father, Julian, was pacing the length of the Persian rug, a tablet in his hand that flickered with 1,000 notifications. My mother, Elena, was staring into her coffee, her eyes red-rimmed and hollow. Sebastian was absent, locked in his room, refusing to speak to anyone since we fled London on a private jet at midnight. "You've committed professional suicide, Arya," my father finally said, stopping to glare at me. "Do you have any idea what you've done? We had contracts, global tours. The Sterling brand was built on Sebastian's image. Now we are a laughingstock. The Prodigy is a fraud, and the copyist is a rebel." "The copyist is the one who wrote the music, Father," I said, my voice calmer than it had ever been. "The fraud was your creation, not mine. I didn't ruin the Sterling brand. I simply stopped upholding the lie that was killing me." "We did it for the family!" my mother suddenly screamed, slamming her hand on the table. "We knew you were brilliant, Arya, but you were unstable. That tremor, your social anxiety, the world wouldn't have accepted a girl who hid in the basement. We gave your music a face. We gave it a stage. Sebastian was your vessel." "A vessel who couldn't even tell a crescendo from a staccato without my notes. You didn't give my music a face, you gave it a cage. You stole my name and gave it to a boy who liked the applause but hated the work. Don't tell me you did it for me. You did it because you were ashamed of a daughter who wasn't perfect for the cameras." My father sat down, his expression shifting from rage to a chilling, calculated calm. He pushed a document across the table. It was a legal contract, freshly drafted. "The damage control starts now," he said. "We will issue a statement saying that the Albert Hall performance was a planned theatrical reveal of the Sterling duo. We will claim that you and Sebastian have always worked as a collaborative team, he as the inspiration, you as the architect. This contract binds your compositions to the Sterling estate for the next 20 years. You will get the credit you crave, but the business stays in the family. Sign it, and we can save the European tour." I looked at the paper. It was a golden leash. They wanted to turn my rebellion into a marketing campaign. They wanted to own my genius officially, now that they couldn't do it secretly. "No," I said, sliding the paper back. "I'm not a duo. I'm not a collaborator. I am the composer. And as of this morning, I have revoked the performance rights for every piece of music I have ever written. Sebastian cannot play a single note of Solstice or the Echo ever again. If he tries, I will sue him and you for every cent you have left." My father's face turned a dangerous shade of gray. "You would leave us with nothing? Your own flesh and blood?" "You left me with nothing for 15 years, Julian. You didn't even give me a seat at your table until I forced my way in. You don't want a daughter. You want a gold mine. Well, the mine is closed." The doorbell rang, not the frantic buzzing of a journalist, but a steady, authoritative chime. My father looked at the security monitor. His eyes widened. It wasn't the police. It was a black car with a diplomatic seal. A few moments later, our housekeeper entered, looking terrified. "Sir, there is a representative from the Royal Academy of Music and a personal envoy from the Royal Box." I stood up. I hadn't expected them so soon. A woman in a sharp gray suit entered the room, ignoring my father entirely. She walked straight to me and handed me a heavy cream-colored envelope embossed with the royal crest. "Miss Arya Sterling," the envoy said, her voice echoing in the tense silence. The king was deeply moved by your performance. He believes that true genius should never be a ghost. The Royal Academy of Music is offering you a full fellowship and a chair of composition effective immediately. Furthermore, the king has requested a private commission, a new symphony for the Autumn Jubilee, to be performed by you, solo. I felt a lump form in my throat. This was the door I had dreamed of, opening not because of my father's influence, but in spite of his. "She's already under contract with us," my father lied, stepping forward, his voice desperate. "She's part of Sterling International Management." "Actually, Mr. Sterling," the envoy said, turning to him with a look of icy disdain, "we've had our legal team review the contracts you had your daughter sign when she was a minor. They are not only predatory, they are unenforceable under current intellectual property laws. Miss Sterling is a free agent, and considering the technical difficulties your son experienced in London, I suggest you focus on your own legal defense regarding the fraudulent marketing of his talent." The silence that followed was absolute. My parents were paralyzed. The walls of their empire weren't just cracking, they were evaporating. I walked to the door, stopping only to look at the stairs. Sebastian was standing on the landing, watching me. He looked like a ghost of the boy I used to know. "Sebastian," I called out, "the music is in the basement. You can keep the Stradivarian, you can keep the tuxedo, but the soul of the Sterling name is leaving with me." He didn't say anything. He just nodded, a single tear tracking through the remnants of yesterday's stage makeup. He knew the truth was better than the lie, even if the truth left him with nothing. I stepped out of the house and into the morning light. The journalists surged forward, but the diplomatic security cleared a path. I didn't hide my face. I didn't look back at the estate. I got into the car, my old battered violin case gripped tightly in my lap. The silent maestro was silent no more. I had a symphony to write, one that wouldn't have to hide in the shadows of a brother who never understood the melody. "Where to, Miss Sterling?" the driver asked. "To London," I said. "I have a throne to claim."
London in the autumn is a city of echoes. The rain on the cobblestones sounds like a metronome, and the wind through the columns of the Royal Academy feels like a low, haunting cello. For the first time in my life, I had a studio with windows. I could see the sky while I composed. But freedom, I realized, is a terrifying thing when you've been a prisoner of shadows for so long. Every note I wrote for the King's Jubilee was a battle against the voice of my father in my head, telling me I was nothing without his guidance. And as the premiere approached, I learned that Julian Sterling wasn't done trying to be my conductor. My life at the Royal Academy was a whirlwind of respect that felt alien to me. Professors who had studied my parents' work now sat in my lectures, pens poised, waiting for me to speak. But I spent most of my time in the practice rooms, obsessed with the Jubilee Symphony. It was to be my masterpiece, a piece that didn't just showcase technical skill, but told the story of a rebirth. "Arya, you're overworking the fourth movement," a voice said from the doorway. It was Marcus Thorne, the dean of the academy, and one of the few people I trusted. He walked in, holding a newspaper. "You need to breathe. The world is already at your feet." "The world is waiting for me to fail, Marcus," I replied, not looking up from the staff paper. "They want to see if the ghost of Albert Hall was just a one-hit wonder or a true maestro. My father is counting on the former." "Speaking of your father," Marcus said, his face darkening, "have you seen the headlines in the tabloids? He's doing interviews, Arya. He's claiming that you stole the Jubilee themes from his private archives. He's telling the press that you are a plagiarist who turned on her family once you'd looted their genius. I felt a cold surge of nausea. Plagiarism, the one accusation that could kill a composer's career before it even began. I knew exactly what he was doing. During my years in the basement, I had kept a composition diary, a notebook of raw ideas, half-finished melodies, and experimental structures. In my haste to leave Vienna, I had left it behind. I thought it was just scrap paper. To my father, it was a weapon. He's going to publish them, isn't he? The sketches. He'll claim he wrote them years ago. He's doing more than that, Marcus said. He's sold the rights to a rival publishing house in Paris. They're planning to release a Sterling Legacy suite based on your sketches 1 week before your Jubilee premiere. If the melodies are the same, the public will think you were the one who copied him. This was Julian Sterling's final move. If he couldn't own my future, he would poison my past. He was willing to destroy his own daughter's reputation just to prove that he was still the master of the house. He didn't care about the music, he only cared about the power. I spent the next 48 hours in a state of controlled rage. I didn't cry. I didn't call him to beg. I did what I do best. I looked at the logic of the music. Those sketches in the diary were immature. They were the cries of a girl who was still learning to breathe. The Jubilee Symphony I was writing now was the work of a woman who had survived the fire. I realized that my father had made a fatal mistake. He assumed that my genius was a static thing he could steal from a notebook. He didn't realize that my music evolves as fast as my heart. Marcus, I said, walking into his office on Monday morning, I need the Academy's legal team, and I need a recording studio, tonight. What are you planning, Arya? My father wants to release my old sketches as his own. Fine, let him, but I'm going to change the Jubilee Symphony. Every theme, every bridge, every modulation. I'm going to rewrite the entire center of the work in 5 days, and I'm going to use those stolen melodies as the foundation for a theme and variations, where the stolen part represents the cage and the new music represents the key. Arya, that's impossible, Marcus breathed. To rewrite a royal commission in a week? You'll collapse. I spent 15 years writing in the dark, Marcus. I can write in the light for 5 days. The week was a blur of caffeine, ink-stained sheets, and the frantic sound of the Academy's copyists trying to keep up with me. I worked until my vision blurred and the tremor in my hand finally returned, not from fear, but from sheer exhaustion. Every time I felt like stopping, I thought of my father in Paris, smugly signing the contracts for my stolen thoughts. I thought of Sebastian, who was likely being forced to practice those very sketches for the Paris release. I used their betrayal as the fuel for a movement I titled The Forgery. It was a satirical, discordant section that mimicked my father's conducting style, only to be overwhelmed by a soaring, defiant violin solo. On the night before the Jubilee, a package arrived at my flat. It was a pre-release copy of the Sterling Legacy suite from the Paris publisher. I played the disc. It was heartbreaking. It was my music, but it was butchered. My father had taken my delicate, experimental melodies and turned them into pompous, overblown marches. He had added heavy brass and predictable rhythms, stripping away the soul to make it sound like his style. It was a crime against art. I sat in the dark listening to the ghost of my younger self being strangled by my father's ego. I knew then that I didn't just have to win, I had to expose the difference between a creator and a thief. The Autumn Jubilee at the Royal Festival Hall was even more prestigious than the Albert Hall. The entire British establishment was there, along with international critics who had flown in to see if the plagiarism scandal was true. As I walked onto the stage, the tension was palpable. My father and mother were sitting in the front row. They had used their last remaining influence to get tickets. They wanted to be there to witness my downfall. My father held his head high, a smirk on his face, as if he had already won. He expected to hear the melodies from the notebook, the ones he had already claimed in the Paris press. I signaled the orchestra. The symphony began. For the first 10 minutes, I played the melodies from the sketches. I saw my father nudge my mother, a look of triumph in his eyes. He leaned back, ready to call his lawyers the moment the concert ended. But then, at the 15-minute mark, the music shifted. The stolen theme began to fragment. It became a parody of itself. The violins began to mock the melody, turning it into something ugly and shallow. Then, with a sudden, thunderous chord from the grand organ, the music broke. I stepped forward with my violin. I played a solo that took the old theme and dismantled it note by note before rebuilding it into something so complex, so modern, and so undeniably mine that the audience gasped. It was a musical live edit. I was showing them in real time how a genius takes a simple thought and turns it into a universe, and how a thief only knows how to copy the surface. I looked directly at my father during the finale. His smirk was gone. His face was a mask of pure, unadulterated shock. He realized that by publishing the sketches, he had given me the perfect foil. He had provided the before to my after. The critics weren't looking at him as a victim of theft. They were looking at the sterling legacy suite as the crude, unfinished scrap heap it was, compared to the Jubilee Symphony. The final movement ended in a blaze of light and sound. The silence that followed was even more profound than in London. Then the hall erupted. The king didn't just stand, he walked to the edge of the royal box and clapped with a fervor that broke all protocol. I had done more than play a symphony. I had performed an exorcism. My father's weapon had become the monument to his own mediocrity. As I bowed, I saw my parents standing up to leave before the lights came on. They were fleeing the scene of their own exposure. The silent maestro had just written the final chapter of their legacy, and the ink was never going to dry.
There are moments when the music stops, and all that is left is the cold, scratching sound of reality. A week after the Jubilee, I was sitting in my London flat, surrounded by bouquets of roses from across Europe and letters of apology from critics who had once doubted me. I had won the public war, but the private one was festering. That night, there was a knock at my door, not the confident stride of a fan or the sharp rap of a journalist. It was a rhythmic, hesitant thud. When I opened the door, I found the one person I thought I had lost to the shadows forever, Sebastian. My brother looked like a ghost that had been haunting a shipwreck. His expensive suit was wrinkled, his golden hair was a mess, and his hands, those hands that the world had once worshipped, were trembling with a violent, uncontrollable rhythm. He didn't look like a prodigy, he looked like a victim. "Arya," he whispered, his voice cracking like dry parchment. "I'm sorry, I didn't know where else to go. They've gone mad. Father, he's lost his mind. He's talking about scorched earth. If he can't have the sterling name, he wants to make sure no one can." I pulled him inside and gave him a glass of water. As he drank, he told me the truth about the weeks in Paris. After the Jubilee disaster, the Paris publishers had sued my father for fraud. The sterling legacy suite was a laughingstock, and the legal fees were mounting. My father had reached a breaking point. He didn't see me as a daughter anymore. He saw me as a virus that had infected his destiny. "He's at the hotel near the academy, Arya," Sebastian said, his eyes wide with terror. "He has the floor plans. He knows where the academy keeps the original manuscripts of the Solstice Symphony and your earlier works. He thinks that if he destroys the physical evidence, the handwritten scores with my notations, he can still claim you were just a tool he used to organize his thoughts. He's going to burn them. My heart went cold. In the digital age, people forget the value of the original ink. Those manuscripts were the only proof of my creative evolution. They contained my corrections, my blood-stained fingerprints, the DNA of my genius. They were the source code of my life. "And Mother?" I asked. "She's packing his bags for the flight to South America," Sebastian replied, a bitter laugh escaping him. "She's still the loyal accompanist, even when the soloist is a monster. But I couldn't do it, Arya. I couldn't watch him kill the only real thing this family ever produced." I stood up, my mind racing. I could call the police, but what would I tell them? That a world-famous conductor was planning to start a fire based on the word of his unstable son? They would think it was just more family drama. I had to act myself. "Sebastian, if you want to be more than a vessel, you have to help me," I said, grabbing my coat. "We need to get to the Academy archives before he does, and we need to record him. We need a confession, not just a rescue." We drove through the rain-slicked streets of London in a frantic silence. Sebastian sat in the passenger seat, clutching his violin case as if it were a shield. I realized then that he had never hated me. He had just been too cowardly to love me more than his own comfort. This was his chance to balance the ledger. The Royal Academy of Music was silent and dark, its stone pillars looking like sentinels in the fog. We used my fellow's key to enter through the side door. The air inside was thick with the scent of old paper and wax. We moved toward the basement archives, the very place that mirrored the studio where I had spent my childhood. As we approached the heavy oak doors of the manuscript room, I smelled it. Gasoline. A shadow moved into darkness. My father was there, holding a canister and a silver lighter, the one he had received from the Vienna Philharmonic on his 50th birthday. He was pouring the liquid over the shelves where my life's work was stored. He looked ancient, his eyes reflecting a flickering madness. "Julian, stop!" I shouted, the sound echoing through the halls like a thunderclap. My father spun around, the lighter clicking in his hand. He didn't look surprised to see me. He looked relieved. "Ah, the architect. Have you come to watch the demolition? You think these papers make you a maestro? They are just paper, Arya. I am the one who gave them meaning. Without me, you are just a girl with a sad story and a broken hand." "The papers are the truth, Father," I said, stepping forward. Sebastian followed me into the light, his phone held discreetly at his side, the recording light glowing red. "You're not just burning my music, Father, you're burning yourself. If you do this, there is no legacy. There is only a criminal in a tuxedo." "There is no legacy anyway," he screamed, his voice breaking. "The press calls me a thief. The publishers want their millions back. I gave you everything. I gave you a home, a name, a brother who was a god, and you took it all and threw it back in my face because you wanted credit?" "I wanted to be seen," I yelled back. "I wanted you to look at me and see a musician, not a copyist. I wrote those symphonies for you, Julian. I wrote them so you would love me. But you didn't love the music. You only loved the power it gave you." He hesitated, the lighter hovering over a stack of my early sonatas. For a second, I saw a flash of the man who used to tuck me in and tell me stories of Mozart, but the flash died, replaced by the cold ash of his pride. "I'm doing this for the sterling name," he whispered. "If the name can't be great, it must be gone." He flicked the lighter, a flame blossomed, but before he could drop it, Sebastian stepped forward. "Do it, Dad," Sebastian said, his voice steady for the first time in his life. "Do it, and the whole world will see the video I'm live streaming right now. Not just your fraud, but your arson. You won't be a fallen genius. You'll be a common arsonist in a prison cell. Is that the legacy you want?" My father froze. He looked at Sebastian, then at the phone, then at me. The realization that his vessel had finally turned against him was the final blow. The lighter slipped from his fingers, clattering onto the cold stone floor. He didn't pick it up. He slumped against the shelves, his head in his hands, and began to sob. I walked over and picked up the lighter, pocketing it. Sebastian stayed by the door, his hand shaking, but his gaze fixed on our father. The silence that followed wasn't the silence of the Albert Hall, it was the silence of a funeral. "Go home, Julian," I said, my voice empty of anger. "The archives are safe. My music is safe. But you, Julian, you are done. The Academy will have your credentials revoked by morning. Sebastian and I are going to the authorities with the recording. Don't try to fly to South America. The airports are already being notified." We left him there, a broken man in a room full of music he would never understand. As we walked out into the London rain, Sebastian turned to me. "What happens now, Aria? I have nothing. I'm a fraud who can't even play the music I took credit for." I looked at my brother, the boy who had finally chosen the truth over the lie. "You have your hands, Sebastian, and you have a sister who knows how to teach. We're going to find your own music. It won't be a symphony. It might just be a simple melody, but it will be yours." The silent maestro had saved her past. Now she was ready to build a future for the only family member who was left. "Let's go, maestro," I said, putting my arm around him. The storm was over. The music was safe.
The world of classical music had always been a gilded cage of decorum and whispered secrets, but the trial of Julian Sterling shattered the glass forever. It was dubbed the trial of the century, a spectacle that combined the drama of a Verdi opera with the cold reality of a criminal court. For 3 months I had been the star witness, the girl whose face was on every screen, whose silence had been bought and then broken. I stood in the lobby of the Old Bailey, the scent of rain and old stone clinging to my coat, knowing that today was the day my mother would try to do what my father couldn't, break my resolve with the weight of my own heart. The courtroom was packed. Every bench was filled with journalists, former colleagues, and curious strangers who had followed the Sterling fraud as if it were a reality show. My father sat in the dock, his face a mask of gaunt shadows. He had lost 30 pounds, and his once imposing presence had shrunk into a suit that no longer fit. He didn't look at me when I entered. He looked at the floor as if counting the tiles. But it was my mother, Elena, who was the real danger. She sat behind the defense team, wearing a black veil like a tragic widow. Throughout the trial, she had played the role of the devoted wife, the woman who didn't know the extent of her husband's crimes, but was determined to suffer for them. "The prosecution calls Elena Sterling to the stand," the bailiff announced. My mother walked to the stand with a practiced elegance. She didn't look like a conspirator, she looked like a victim. Her testimony was a masterclass in emotional manipulation. She spoke of the sacrifices they had made for their children, of the pressure of the Sterling name, and of how Sebastian's anxiety had led them to support him in unconventional ways. She made it sound like a family tragedy rather than a corporate fraud. "And what of your daughter, Aria?" asked the defense attorney, his voice soft with feigned sympathy. "Was she neglected, as the press claims?" "Neglected?" My mother let out a delicate, trembling sigh. "Aria was our heartbeat. We gave her the space she needed to create. She was shy, fragile. We protected her from the spotlight because we didn't want her to break. We didn't steal her music. We cherished it in the privacy of our home. Everything we did was to ensure the Sterling legacy would survive for both of them." I felt a surge of cold fury. She was rewriting history again, turning my basement cell into a sanctuary. I looked at Sebastian, who sat beside me in the gallery. He was pale, his knuckles white as he gripped his cane. He had been diagnosed with a stress-induced nerve condition since the night in the archives. He would never play the violin professionally again, a final poetic irony of his fake career. As the court recessed for lunch, my mother approached me in the corridor. She didn't have the veil on now. Her eyes were sharp and desperate. "Arya, stop this," she whispered, grabbing my arm. "The legal fees are exhausting the last of the trust. Your father will die in prison if he's convicted on all counts. Is that what you want? To be the girl who killed her own father? Just say you were a collaborator. Tell them you were part of the plan. They'll drop the criminal charges, and we can settle the rest civilly." "I was a collaborator, Mother," I said, pulling my arm away. "I collaborated in my own disappearance for 15 years. I helped you lie to the world because I thought if I was good enough, you would eventually love me for who I was, not for what I wrote. But you never did. Even now, you're not asking how I am. You're asking for the bank account." "You are so cold," she hissed, her face contorting. "You have your fame now. You have the Royal Academy. Why do you need to see us in the dirt? You're just as cruel as Julian ever was." "The difference, Mother, is that my cruelty is the truth. Yours was a symphony of lies." I returned to the witness stand that afternoon for my final cross-examination. The defense attorney was a man who specialized in character assassination. He had spent days digging into my medical records, my childhood journals, and my bank statements. "Miss Sterling," he began, pacing in front of the jury, "you claim you were a ghost, but the records show you were paid a monthly allowance from the Sterling estate. You traveled the world, you lived in luxury. Isn't it true that you were perfectly happy to take the money and the lifestyle, only turning on your family when you saw a chance for a solo career?" "I was paid a salary to stay in the basement and produce a product," I replied, my voice steady. "The luxury was a cage I wasn't allowed to leave without a chaperone. I didn't turn on my family. I simply refused to be a ghost any longer." "And yet," the attorney continued, pulling out a document, "we have a recording from the Vienna estate. A domestic staff member recorded a conversation where you told your brother, and I quote, 'I'm going to destroy them all.' This sounds like a premeditated act of revenge, not a search for justice." The courtroom gasped. My father looked up, a glimmer of hope in his eyes. My mother smirked behind her veil. They had found the one moment where my anger had boiled over into a threat. "I said those words," I admitted, looking the attorney in the eye. "I said them on the night I found out my father had pawned my grandmother's violin, the only instrument I loved, to pay for a billboard for Sebastian's tour. I was 19 years old, and I realized that to my parents, I wasn't a daughter. I was a spare part. I wanted to destroy the lie. I still do." I looked at the jury. "The defense wants you to believe this is about a jealous daughter, but I ask you to look at the scores, look at the handwritten drafts, look at the blood on the pages where I played until my fingers cracked. A lie can be told with words, but it cannot be told with music. Music is the only thing that cannot be faked. If I am the liar, why is it that only I can play the music you've heard? I took my violin, the one the Academy had provided, a beautiful Guarari, and I did something forbidden in a court of law. I tucked it under my chin. 'Objection!' the defense screamed. 'This is not a performance.' 'Sit down, counselor,' the judge said, his voice echoing. 'The witness is demonstrating her testimony.' I played 3 bars of the echo. First, I played it exactly as Sebastian had performed it, stiff, technically proficient, but hollow. Then I played it as it was written, with the microtonal shifts and the emotional swells that only the composer could understand.
The silence in the courtroom was a different kind of silence than the Albert Hall. It was the silence of people realizing they were in the presence of a truth that no lawyer could cross-examine. My father began to weep. Not the silent, manipulative tears of my mother, but the heavy, racking sobs of a man who realized he had traded a diamond for a piece of glass. "I have no more words," I said, lowering the violin. "The music is the evidence." I stepped down from the stand. As I walked past the dock, my father reached out a hand. He didn't say anything. He just touched the sleeve of my coat for a second before the guards pulled him back. The jury took less than 4 hours. Guilty on all counts. As the judge read the sentence, 10 years for Julian, 5 years of house arrest and massive restitution for Elena, I walked out of the building. Sebastian was waiting for me. He looked at the sky, the rain washing the tension from his face. "Is it over, Arya?" he asked. "The trial is over, Sebastian. Now we have to find out what happens after the finale."
1 year later, the name Arya Sterling was no longer a headline about a scandal. It was carved into the cornerstone of the new wing at the Royal Academy. I was no longer the ghost. I was the maestro. But the most difficult composition I had ever undertaken wasn't a symphony for a king. It was the reconstruction of a brother who had been hollowed out by a decade of lies. Sebastian sat across from me in my private studio, the sunlight catching the dust motes in the air. He wasn't holding a violin anymore. His nerves wouldn't allow it. He was holding a simple pencil, staring at a blank sheet of staff paper as if it were a mirror reflecting his own emptiness. "I can't do it, Arya," Sebastian whispered, dropping the pencil. It rolled across the mahogany floor, a tiny sound that felt like a falling monument. "The notes, they don't mean anything to me without a speaker or a recording. I look at the lines and I see a cage. I'm 30 years old and I'm starting at the level of a 6-year-old. The world thinks I'm a pariah. They're right." "The world thinks what they are told to think, Sebastian," I said, picking up the pencil and handing it back to him. "For 10 years they were told you were a genius. For the last year they've been told you're a monster. Both were labels created by our father. Today, you are just a student, and I am just a teacher. Write one note, not a melody, not a chord, just one middle C. Make it exist." It was a slow, painful process. Every morning from 9 a.m. to noon, the great Arya Sterling would lock her doors to the world's elite to teach the fraud of the century the basic laws of harmony. It was my way of reclaiming him from the ruins, but the world outside wasn't as forgiving as I was. The tabloids had shifted their focus. They couldn't attack me anymore. I was too powerful, too beloved by the crown. So they hunted the weakest link. "The parasite in the academy," the headlines screamed. "Arya Sterling harbors the fraud who stole her life." A petition had started circulating among the board of directors to ban Sebastian from the campus grounds. They claimed his presence tarnished the prestige of the institution. "You have to let me go, Arya," Sebastian said one afternoon, showing me a viral video of a protest outside the academy gates. People were holding signs with his face crossed out. "They're saying you're keeping me as a trophy to show off your mercy." "Is that what you think?" I asked, not looking away from my score. "I think I'm a shadow that won't stop following you into the light. I should disappear, change my name, go to a place where sterling is just a word for silver." I stood up and walked to the window. Below, the journalists were waiting like vultures. They wanted a statement. They wanted me to cast him out. They wanted the final movement of the tragedy to be the sister exiling the brother. "My father tried to destroy me with silence. The public wants to destroy you with noise. Both are forms of execution. If I cast you out now, Sebastian, I'm agreeing with them that people are disposable assets. I'm becoming Julian, and I refuse to be Julian." That evening, I did something that horrified my PR team. I announced an open masterclass in the Grand Hall of the Academy. I invited the press, the board, and the protesters. I told them I would be demonstrating the genesis of composition. The hall was packed with a hostile energy. When I walked onto the stage, the applause was lukewarm, tainted by the presence of Sebastian, who sat in a chair behind me, looking like a man facing a firing squad. Many of you have asked why I allow a fraud in these halls. I began, my voice amplified by the silent tension of the room. You speak of prestige and legacy, but music is not about prestige. It is about the truth of the human voice. For 15 years, my brother was forced to be a voice that wasn't his. He was a victim of a forgery he was too young and too afraid to stop. I turned to Sebastian. Sebastian, come here. He walked to the piano, his movements stiff. The room erupted in boos and callcats. I held up my hand, and the authority in my gaze was enough to dampen the noise. We are not here to play the Solstice Symphony, I said to the crowd. We are here to show you what happens when a soul tries to find itself after the music was stolen. I looked at Sebastian. The theme we worked on this morning, the 3 notes, play them. Sebastian's hand hovered over the keys. He was shaking. The silence in the hall was agonizing. He looked at me, his eyes pleading for a way out. I just nodded. He pressed 3 keys, E, G, B. A simple minor fragment. It was thin, hesitant, and technically unremarkable. Now, I said, picking up my violin, I will show you what a composer does with the truth of another. I began to improvise around his 3 notes. I didn't play with the grandiosity of the Jubilee. I played with a soft, aching tenderness. I took his 3 small, unremarkable notes and I built a garden around them. I showed the audience that those notes weren't fraudulent. They were the first honest sounds Sebastian Sterling had ever made in his life. The transformation in the room was palpable. The anger began to dissolve into a profound, uncomfortable realization. They weren't watching a fraud, they were watching a rebirth. I wasn't harboring a criminal, I was mentoring a survivor. When we finished, there was no thunderous applause. There was something much more valuable, a respectful, contemplative quiet. I looked at the board members in the front row. They were looking at their hands. The petition, I knew, was dead. As we walked off the stage, Sebastian stopped in the wings. For the first time in a year, he didn't look like he was trying to vanish. They didn't boo, he whispered. They couldn't, I said. You can't boo the truth, Sebastian. It's the only thing in this world that is truly sterling. But as we felt the weight of the victory, a letter was waiting for me in my dressing room. It was from the prison in Vienna. My father was requesting a final visit. He was dying, and he had a final revelation about the Sterling line, a secret that even the trial hadn't uncovered, a secret that threatened to turn my victory into a hollow echo. I looked at Sebastian, then at the letter. The past wasn't done with us yet.
The journey from London to the Vienna prison felt like traveling backward through a hall of mirrors. The closer I got to my father, the more the world seemed to lose its color. I had spent a year building a life of light, yet Julian Sterling's shadow still had the power to reach across borders. He was dying in a cold cell, a king without a country, but he had sent for me with a promise of a final revelation. I walked through the iron gates, the severance of blood already signed in my heart, ready to hear the last lie of the man who had tried to steal my soul. The infirmary was a grim, sterile place. Julian looked like a skeleton draped in gray linen. His eyes, once so commanding on the podium, were now sunken pits of feverish intensity. When I sat down beside his bed, he didn't ask for forgiveness. He didn't even say my name. He simply reached for a small leather-bound box on the nightstand and pushed it toward me with a trembling hand. "You think you won, Arya," he whispered, his breath smelling of medicine and decay.
You think you proved that genius is born, not made, but you don't even know where your genius came from. You were never meant to be a Sterling. You were meant to be an experiment. Experiments are for laboratories, Father, I said, my voice as steady as a mountain. I am a woman who writes symphonies. Whatever is in this box won't change the notes I've already played. Open it, he hissed. I opened the box. Inside was a birth certificate from an orphanage in Cremona, Italy, and a series of letters tied with a black ribbon. My heart skipped a beat as I read the names. Julian and Elena were not my biological parents. I had been adopted at 6 months old, but it wasn't a random adoption. The letters were from a woman named Sofia Corelli, a legendary violinist who had disappeared from the public eye 30 years ago, rumored to have died in poverty. She was the greatest of her generation, he gasped, a twisted smile on his lips. But she was unstable, mad. She couldn't handle the stage. When she died, I found you. I saw the potential. I wanted to see if I could take the Corelli fire and shape it with sterling discipline. But you were too much like her. You were uncontrollable. That tremor, it wasn't a flaw, Arya. It was her signature. She had it too. I stared at the letters. Sofia Corelli, my mother. The reason my father had hidden me in the basement wasn't just because of Sebastian's image. It was because every time he looked at me, he saw a genius he couldn't claim as his own blood. He had tried to breed a prodigy in Sebastian and failed, so he tried to tame a prodigy in me and failed even harder. You hid me because I was a reminder of your own mediocrity, I said, the realization washing over me like a cold wave. You didn't adopt a daughter, you looted a grave. You thought that if you kept me in the dark, my light would eventually belong to you. But light doesn't work that way, Julian. I made you, he screamed, coughing violently. Without my house, without my name, you would have been a beggar in Cremona. I gave you the tools. No, I stood up, clutching the box to my chest. You gave me the cage. My mother gave me the music, and I gave myself the courage to play it. I walked out of the infirmary without looking back. As I reached the prison gates, I saw the sun setting over the Vienna skyline. The city that had once felt like a prison now felt like just another stop on a long journey. I wasn't Arya Sterling, the daughter of a fraud. I was Arya Corelli, the daughter of the fire. I returned to London with a new purpose. I didn't change my name legally. The world knew me as Sterling, and I would use that name to finish the work of dismantling the old regime. But I began a new project, a symphony not for a king, but for the nameless, the hidden, and the unstable. I titled it The Cremona Suite. The premiere of the Cremona Suite at the Royal Albert Hall was the final act of my liberation. This time, I didn't just play, I conducted. I stood on the podium where my father had once stood, but I didn't use a baton, I used my hands. I led the orchestra through a work that was chaotic, beautiful, and raw. It was the sound of 1,000 ghosts finally finding their voices. Sebastian was in the front row. He wasn't crying, he was smiling. He had finally finished his first original composition, a simple 3-minute piece for solo piano. It wasn't a masterpiece, but it was his. He had found his own soil. During the final movement, I stepped down from the podium and picked up my violin. I played a duet with the lead cellist, a melody Sofia Corelli had hummed in one of her letters. It was a bridge across time, a reconnection of a severed line. I felt the tremor in my hand, and for the first time, I didn't fight it. I let it vibrate through the string. It wasn't a flaw. It was a heartbeat. The applause that followed was different from any I had ever heard. It wasn't a roar of shock or a polite tribute to royalty. It was the sound of a community, people who had been moved not by a prodigy, but by a human being who had survived the dark.
After the concert, I walked backstage to my dressing room. A single rose was waiting for me on the table, along with a note from my mother, Elena. She was still under house arrest, her life a shadow of what it once was. You are your own maestro, Arya. I see that now. I hope the fire is warmer than the stone. I didn't peep the note. I placed it in the trash. I didn't need her validation anymore. I had found the source code, and it was written in my own DNA, not in her husband's ledgers. I walked out into the London night with Sebastian. The air was crisp, and the stars were bright. We walked along the Thames, the water reflecting the city lights like a million diamonds. "What now, Arya?" Sebastian asked, looking at the horizon. "Now," I said, feeling the weight of the violin case in my hand, a weight that had become light. "We're going to open the doors. No more basements, no more ghosts. We're going to start a school in Cremona for the children who are too much for the world. We are going to teach them that the music doesn't belong to the conductors. It belongs to the hearts that beat it." I looked at my brother, the man who had been my shadow and now my partner. I thought of the basement in Vienna, the ink-stained fingers and the years of silence. All of it had been a prelude. The real symphony was just beginning. I tucked my violin under my arm and started to whistle a new tune, a melody that hadn't been written down yet. It was simple, bright, and free. The silent maestro was gone, the true maestro had taken her place, and the world was finally perfectly in tune.